as we let a few more people in, but thank you so much. All right, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us again for this virtual tour of the Timken Museum. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. If you do have a question, please feel free to use the chat function on Zoom in order to type your question, and we will address all questions at the end of today's presentation. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, you can do the same in the comment section. You can drop your question there, and we'd be happy to answer those at the end. We'll be monitoring that section as well. Lastly, this presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our social media channels once we are done. So our Facebook page and our YouTube page, you can find this presentation once it's finished, as well as any other previous presentations being put on by the Timken. So again, thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have our docent today, Susan, presenting on some highlights of the Timken Museum. Thank you so much, Susan, for doing this for us. I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you. I don't see my face in the little box.
That's okay, Susan. We can see you.
Oh, good. Now I don't know what I did. You can see me? Very good.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy and honored to be able to speak to you today about some of the highlights of the collection and to stress the concept of decoding these highlights, these masterpieces, what's going on underneath what you see. And hopefully this presentation will make the images that you see, the great masterpieces, more interesting. We'll start with, if you walked into the Timken Museum, the first thing you'd see are 4 tapestries from the series Stories of Queen Artemisia, with central designs by Antoine Caron, who designed them in France in the Renaissance period, 1562 to 1565. The 4 tapestries that you see in front of you now are from a series of at least 18, all of which were made in Paris to decorate the palace of Duke Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, who was, and this palace was in Turin, Italy, in 1562 to 1630 was his reign. The 4 tapestries illustrate episodes from the stories of a very special queen, Artemisia. She was like as powerful a queen as maybe Cleopatra. This is an epic tale created in the 1560s by a Frenchman, Nicolas Huel. The tale is about the lives of 2 ancient queens, both of whom were named Artemisia, combining them into a single queen of the same name. So 3 of the panels show this monarch rewarding her soldiers with the spoils of war, taking requests from her citizens on small pieces of paper, and then listening to the reading of a petition. And all these acts represent the wisdom of an enlightened queen who was a monarch. The 4th panel depicts a group of soldiers. All the panels are woven of wool and silk with metallic silver and silver gilt threads. They used real silver and real gold. At the top of each panel are the ducal arms of Charles Emmanuel of Savoy, and in the bottom border, the monogram is thought to stand for Queen Artemisia and her husband, Mazulis. So these 4 tapestries, again, the request of the citizens, the petitions, the queen distributing the booty, and a group of soldiers. Now let's look at this 4th tapestry a little more closely, the queen distributing the booty. This tapestry was woven sometime between 1611 and 1620 in France in the 17th century. By the way, I have to tell you, I have a PhD in French, and my area of specialization was the great works of France, which is the 17th century, the golden age of France, Molière, Racine, Corneille, the greats. So this tapestry was woven during this very important 17th century with, of course, Louis XIV, the Sun King, who was alive at the time. The central designs were by Antoine Caron, and the border designs are probably by another guy named Henri Rembrandt. The cartoons or the drawings were drawn by various French artists in France around 1600 to 1617. Louis XIII was in power. Louis XIV comes in a little bit later, around 1644. The tapestry was actually woven by various masters in the Faubourg Saint-Marcel manufactory of Marc de Comence, who was Flemish, and Francois de la Planche, also a Flemish guy, who were both of whom were in Paris around 1620. It is woven with dyed and undyed wool, silk threads, silver gilt metallic threads.
Sorry,
Now,
give me
move
one
on.
second. Let me get our share back up. Sorry, give me 1 second, Susan. I apologize for that.
No problem.
Give me 1 second here.
Okay.
All right, go ahead, Susan. Sorry about
And
that.
we're moving into the Russian gallery where we find the icons. Russian icons are sacred images, which an icon in general is a word from the Greek meaning image or resemblance. The iconostasis is a Russian word for a sanctuary screen with icons displayed on it. Icons are used in religious devotion, mostly in the cultures of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And icons are paintings on wood of holy figures such as Christ, the Virgin Mary, saints, and angels and apostles. These religious images are displayed on a wall of icons called the iconostasis. That wall of icons separates the sanctuary and the nave in a church. Icons are the prevalent art form in the Russian Orthodox Church. Icons date back to the very early days of Christianity, and the icon tradition can be traced back as far as the 3rd century. The iconostasis symbolizes a boundary between the divine and the human worlds. The Timken Museum has one of the largest and most important collections of Russian icons in the world outside of Russia. Thanks to the Putnam sisters who collected them during the 1930s through the 1980s. Jesus, Mary, and the saints represented in the icons are often illuminated by lamps and candles. The faithful usually kneel before these icons. They cross themselves to symbolize the Trinity, and they kiss the icons. The icon is a sign of the presence of God. These icons provided an aid to worship for the literate as well as the illiterate in Russia, because the icons told a picture, not in words, but in pictures, told a story in pictures. And the icons brought together the Russian society by enabling the transmission of the religious stories told in pictures rather than in written words. Icons are actually believed to be divinely revealed. The figures represented in the icons are two-dimensional. They are idealized. They are not natural. They are not realistic. The religious figures have elongated features, such as long, thin fingers pointing upward toward heaven. The heads of the 6 figures in the deesis icons are all tilted, as if in reverence to God. And their eyes are large and soulful. Icons are drawn in a very flat Byzantine style, with little or no conventional perspective. They're full of religious symbolism. I'm again decoding. That was generally understood by the worshipers in the Russian Orthodox Church. These are spiritual figures. They are not ordinary people. they are depicted in idealized fashion in the icons. So let's look now at the dioesis icons, which date back to the 15th century, Renaissance. And they were done in the Novgorod school in Russia. The dioesis tier of an iconostasis and the royal gates are both works of art of the 15th century. And they were done in the Novgorodian school that form the dominant exposition of the Timken icon collection. The dioesis is the prayer row, consisting here of 6 separate icons, with the 7th icon in the middle depicting the Savior enthroned. That's what you see up above these 3 images projected on the screen. The dioesis is the prayer row with 6 icons. The 7th icon is in the middle, depicting the Savior enthroned. These 7 icons are all made of tempera on wood. The golden background of the 6 icons surrounding the Savior enthroned symbolizes the spiritual world that is divinely inspired and that is radiant. The golden halos that each of them have also symbolize the grandeur and the magnificence of heaven, where there is no evil and there is no darkness. The dioesis, or the prayer row, is the first row in the iconostasis, and it's located in the Timken Museum above another icon called the Royal Gates, which were also done in the 15th century in the Novgorod school in Russia, and which we will discuss a little later. So looking at the dioesis, which is referred to as the Savior enthroned, what are we looking at here? This is Jesus Christ depicted as an emperor who is seated on a throne in the heavenly court. Jesus is wearing a red robe covered over in a blue cloak. The red symbolizes humanity, and the blue represents divinity. Jesus holds a closed gospel in his left hand, and he raises his right hand to make a blessing. Christ appears as the creator, the Lord of heaven, the judge, and 6 very small church fathers, who may be Russian saints, are depicted standing 3 on each side of the upper quarter of the painting. Standing on Jesus' immediate right and left are, of course, the Virgin Mary and St. John the Baptist. Mary wears a blue outer garment. What's the symbol of that? Her heavenly nature. In the middle are archangels, Michael and Gabriel, with wings and spheres and staffs in their hands, wearing red robes called hymatians, which are thrown over one shoulder. The archangel Michael is distinguished by contrast and brightness of colors and elegance of the contours. But the archangel Gabriel is painted in soft and muffled tones. The hymation, or the robe of the archangel Gabriel, is done in a quiet red rosy tone, with lightning and folds of an olive green tunic decorated with a rich border and precious stones. His neck modeling is very soft. The apostles Peter and Paul are on the far ends of this dioesis. St. Peter, to the right of the Savior, is shown as an old man with gray hair and a beard. He holds a white scroll, and he holds a key, which is the key to the kingdom of heaven. From these subtle differences, we can assume that the master of the icon was familiar with the classical traditions of art. The Apostle Paul is an example of the interpretation of the classics in the Novgorodian art. It is a harmonious, balanced image that inspires calmness and spiritual concentration. The folds of his clothes have classical outlines. When I say classical, I refer to the concept of moderation, of Cartesian balance and harmony. They are called, the folds of his clothes have classical outlines in it, but his hands are with very long fingers, and they're depicted softly, elegantly, classically. This is a very refined artistic manner. Now let's look at the royal gates. They are, as you see right in front of you, they are the doors that the Tsar uses. The Tsar, who was the leader of France until the Soviet Union was established in 1917 after the revolution. So the royal gates are the Tsar's doors. They are set in the center of the iconostasis. They're called the royal gates. Why? Because Christ, who is the King of glory, is represented by his priests. He enters the royal gates that lead to the altar. Only the clergy may pass through the royal gates. Typically, a curtain is hung on the inside of the gates, and the curtain is opened during various parts of the divine service. An iconostasis typically has northern and southern doors to the right and left of the royal gates, known as the deacons' doors, because only the deacons use them during services. The royal gates were made again in Novgorod a little later in the 15th century. They're made of wood, carved with 3 registers on each half. The doors depict the Annunciation at the top, where the Archangel Gabriel is announcing to the Virgin Mary that she is to become the mother of Jesus, the Son of God. The other 4 panels represent the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, in the home of the Putnam sisters, Russian icons hung on the walls. Sister Amy, who studied Russian in college, had a special interest in the Russian icons. Over a fireplace, a large icon of the Jerusalem Mother of God, also referred to as the Georgian Mother of God, which we will show you a little later, hung for all to see in her home. Since ancient times, this icon in Russia is believed to be an instrument of miracles. It was one of Amy's favorite icons. So let's look at this Jerusalem Mother of God. It is a large, it's absolutely magnificent. Here referred to as the Georgian Mother of God, elsewhere referred to as the Jerusalem Mother of God. It is a large 17th century icon of the Moscow school. Again, made elsewhere, not in Novgorod, made in Moscow. And it's in that great century, the 17th century. The Mother of God is depicted in the pose of the Hodegetria, which is the Greek word for the pointer of the way. This is an icon of the Virgin Mary pointing with her right hand to the Christ child, because he is the way, he is the truth, he is the life. Mary, Mother of God, holds the Christ child on her left leg as they both look tenderly at each other. Mary's right hand gestures toward Jesus, and this is interpreted as she who shows the way. This icon first appeared in the Sofia Cathedral in Novgorod as a gift from Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich. It was loved by everyone. Ivan the Terrible, another Tsar, transferred the icon to the Dormition Cathedral in the Moscow Kremlin. He placed it on one of the pillars there, and there it remained. Jesus offers his mother a small sheaf of wheat. What is this the symbol of? It's the symbol of the bread of the Eucharist. In his left hand, Christ holds a white scroll, symbolizing his teachings. The scroll is the Old Testament's law, and Jesus is the fulfillment of that law. The letters on each side of the Virgin's head, which is tilted, mean Maria, Mother of God. The letters above Christ's halo, you see ICXC, mean Jesus Christ. Mary wears a green undergarment and a red maphoria embroidered with 3 stars. Mary has 3 stars on her garment, signifying her virginity before, during, and after the birth of God, at the birth of Christ. Both Mary and Jesus have golden halos. The Christ child wears a short white tunic under a striated orange and gold royal chiton. The symbol above his head, as I explained earlier, which is says Jesus Christ, and his halo contains a cross and the Greek abbreviation for the words, I am. One of the most striking features of this icon are the many holes, the nail holes in a right angle pattern. What are these holes? Well, they indicate that the icon had once been overlaid with a cover called a basma oclad. The basma is gilded silver. Remember, these are very, very valuable icons. Words delivered, images delivered by God, divinely inspired. So the basma is gilded silver, usually made in small squares or long strips to cover the background of an icon. It was attached with a very small, thin silver nail to protect the icon. So the Jerusalem Mother of God is a favorite icon of Georgian Christians, and it is often therefore referred to as the Georgian Mother of God later on in the 18th and 19th centuries. It is a magnificent work. By the way, how on earth did Amy Putnam get this icon and other icons from Russia? Well, in 1917, there was a Russian Revolution, and the whole country was impoverished. They killed the Tsar and the Tsar's family, and there was total pandemonium. Russia needed money to survive. So the Soviet Union was establishing itself, and so it sold Amy Putnam some of its most valuable treasures for money. Okay. By the way, the other thing I wanted to tell you is my family was from Russia. I was the firstborn American in the United States to speak English, and I heard Russian in the house, but they wouldn't let me speak it because only English could be spoken in our immigrant home. So I studied Russian in college. A lot of the icons have words in Russian, and I can't understand them. And that's because the Russian used on the icons is Old Church Slavonic. It is not modern Russian language, much to my dismay. Okay, now let's move on to the Italian gallery, and you will see this gorgeous image of Bartolomeo Veneto's A Portrait of a Lady in a Green Dress that was done in the middle of this extraordinary era called the Renaissance in 1530. Bartolomeo Veneto is a Renaissance master, and this portrait is the last signed work of Bartolomeo. It's possibly the final portrait by Bartolomeo, as well as one of the best preserved works. Timken is very lucky to have this. Portraits of individuals were very popular in Italy and in Northern Europe, and in the period of this Renaissance. There was some question as to the identity of who the sitter is in this portrait. The lady in this portrait is quite magnificent. She has a commanding gaze. She's wearing very beautiful and opulent clothing. Her elaborate and exotic headdress is richly decorated, and it sits on top of her neatly coiffed brown hair, like a crown of curls. This hairpiece has blue and gold ribbons on it, with a white bow and a jeweled pin in the center. Her hairstyle is simple, with a part in the middle, and her hair is drawn back smoothly over her temples. Her very lush green silk dress, her enormous hair covering, her long blue lapis lazuli rosary beads, very expensive, serve as a necklace, and her two golden rings, one on her pinky, one on her index finger, are all quite lavish and extraordinary. These details reveal what? That this is a lady of high social status. Her elaborate dress is magnificent, especially the big puffy sleeves, which have long cuts below the elbows to reveal a rich white lining, which is embroidered beautifully in black, and shown clearly at her wrists. She wears an Eastern style shimmering golden shoulder covering called a bavero, whose deep neckline reveals her beautiful white skin, which is so revered by the nobility. The bavero is made of silk damask, embroidered with a royal pomegranate motif, which also reveals her high social status. On her waist, she wears a violet-colored sash with a large ribbon. On her right hand, she wears a falconer glove, and she holds the other glove in her left hand. Her rich and costly clothing reveals that she's a lady of high birth. Maybe she's ready to go out too, or maybe she just returned from a hunt. A powerful light directed from the left of the painting illuminates the very natural features of this fine lady. Look how natural, realistic it is compared to the Byzantine icons featured that we discussed earlier. These are very natural features of this fine lady, sculpted with deep shadows. She's depicted from a slightly elevated vantage point and painted against a dark red velvet curtain in the background. This lady of obvious noble birth is presented as a real person, not an allegorical beauty. Her head is turned 3/4, as if her attention is drawn to an onlooker. The very angled gaze in her eyes, as well as her quizzical expression, seem to say she is suspicious about something. She draws our attention to her very physical and psychological presence on the canvas. Moving away now from the very unnatural and highly idealized Byzantine representation that we saw earlier of the Georgian Mother of God. Here she has an air of regal authority and magnificence, probably due to her 3/4 length appearance on the canvas. The actual identity of the sitter for this portrait is controversial, but one scholar suggests that the sitter is Maria Paleologo, who lived from 1508 to 1530, who was the heiress of Monferrato. The next painting that we'll look at is one of Il Guercino, and it's called, I love this painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And it was done in the height of the 17th century, 1654 to 1655. Again, the great classical century. The artist's real name is Giovanni Francesco Barbieri. Il Guercino is a nickname which means squint-eyed. He was greatly influenced by the artists of his time, by Carracci and the chiaroscuro of Caravaggio, as well as the naturalism of artists in Bologna. His chief competitor in Bologna was Guido Reni, but after Reni's death in 1642, Il Guercino became the head of the Bolognese school of painting. The Return of the Prodigal Son was done in 1654 to 1655, which was about 10 years before Guercino's death. So this is one of the highlights of this great artist, and the Timken is very fortunate to have this great painting. So this Return of the Prodigal Son is based on a parable taken from the New Testament, which teaches the virtues of forgiveness and repentance. The father, as you see in the middle of this painting, had 2 sons, and he divided his big fortune and his big estate between them. But the younger son, who you see here to his right, left home and squandered his portion of the estate by living a scandalous life until he became totally impoverished, and he was reduced to tending pigs and eating their slops. The younger son is penitent, remorseful when he returns home to his understanding and merciful father. The father has told his servant here, who is to the left of the father, to draw the curtain, perhaps to hide the younger son's shame. He tells the servant to get some fine clothes and to kill a fatted calf, to make a feast. When the elder son returns, this brother is angry, and he has to be calmed down by his father, who explained that his brother was dead and he's now alive again. He was lost and he is now found. So Il Guercino painted the subject of the return of the prodigal son 6 times, using half-length figures. This painting in the Timken is filled with a real sense of pathos and tenderness. The colors are soft, delicate, almost pastel in tone. The father is dressed in what looks like a purple silk robes with a red lining, very rich. It's draped over one shoulder. And he tries to drape this over his almost naked and bare-chested son to protect him. The father wears a blue turban. He has a long beard signifying his advanced age. And he holds his son's outstretched hand to comfort his son. The son is crying. He holds a simple white cloth to his eyes. His head is bent to one side in shame. His scanty clothes reveal the impoverishment in contrast to the elegant clothes of the father. The boy's pants, if you look closely, are torn and short. He covers his waist with a short white cloth. The painting shows a little bit of blue sky in the right, maybe a sign of hope. In the right-hand corner, you'll see a white cloud almost covering the sky, which is the shame. The servant's clothes are more elaborate than the prodigal son's. The servant wears a white shirt with a black trim and blue trousers with slits. The father is very merciful, very understanding of the son who is grieving over his lost fortune and his wicked lifestyle. The characters in this painting are drawn with great skill, with naturalism. As for example, take a look at the veins in the father's hands. Take a look at the anatomy of the prodigal son's chest, his arm shaded, and the ribs on his chest, and the shading under his left arm. His long brown curly hair reminds us that he is still a child, and his tears confirm the soulful depiction of his repentance. The imagery in this painting is powerful. It needs decoding, and it is quite classical in style, yet at the same time, very emotional. So now we move on to the French paintings, and we're going to look at this pastoral landscape by Claude Lorrain, painted in 1646 and to 1647, once again, in my century, the great 17th century. And this is why I've chosen this painting. It's a pastoral landscape by Lorrain, a 17th century painter who was also a printmaker, and he was also an art theorist who was admired for his Baroque classical landscapes and his emphasis on dramatic contrasts of light and shade. Claude Lorrain is best known for and one of the greatest masters of what is referred to as the ideal landscape painting. This painting represents an idyllic view of nature which is even more beautiful and more harmonious than nature itself. It captures the sublime beauty of 5 people who are in the foreground, and they're spending a day leisurely in the splendor of this tranquil countryside setting, filled with thick, dark green foliage, rocks, and high trees on rolling hills. In this dark foreground, to the right, we see a shepherd wearing a brown piece of clothing from ancient times. That's the classical part. And carrying a stick. He's surrounded by his 2 dogs, and he is busy happily tending to his cattle. Amidst this darkness, one of the cows is a bright white color, balanced by the white colors of two of the pastoral figures and a white folded cloth in a brown basket near the three figures on the left. Again, this is classicism. Balance, harmony, Cartesian, Descartes. The rest of the foreground is very dark. On the right, there is a peasant woman near the shepherd, carrying a basket on her shoulder. She's wearing a bright blue dress. To their left, there is another shepherd with very muscular legs who's seated on a rock, possibly having his toenails tended to or having his feet washed by a woman wearing a blue dress and also a white collar. Near the seated shepherd is another woman standing up and dressed in brown. She looks at the shepherd as he looks admiringly at her. In the midground of the painting, there is a light blue winding river, a prominent ancient fort high on a hill, and lighter, more rolling hills in the background. In the background, we see a light blue sky filled with puffs of white clouds. Claude Lorrain's landscape art is governed by the classical concepts of painting that typically feature antique ruins. Here you see the antique fort. And also the classical concepts of painting usually feature pastoral figures, like the shepherds and the peasant woman in classical dress. Here the sun is hidden, but it's suggested by long shadows in this. Either this is an early morning or an evening setting, clearly in the countryside. The style of this pastoral landscape is typical of what we refer to as high Baroque classicism. Some of the characteristics of Baroque art are grandeur, sensuous richness, drama. The two people looking at each other is vitality, movement, tension, emotional exuberance, many of which are seen in this painting. Classicism in art generally refers to a high regard for the classical period, classical antiquity, Rome and Greece, in order to set standards for taste, with an emphasis on balance and harmony, and above all, moderation. So let's look a little bit about the life of Claude Lorrain. He was born of poor parents at Chamagne, a village in the independent Duchy of Lorraine. He received almost no schooling. He was brought up to be a pastry cook. His parents died when he was only 12 years old. And soon after their death, he traveled to Rome, where he was trained as an artist by Agostino Tassi, a landscapist and the leading Italian painter of illusionistic architectural frescoes. Claude Lorrain spent 2 years in Naples with Goffredo Vaz, another pupil of Tassi. Tassi taught Claude Lorrain about perspective, gave him the basic vocabulary of his art, landscapes with buildings and little figures, small figures, both of which are represented in this painting. He studied briefly under Claude Derouet in France, but he returned to Rome in 1626 and settled there permanently. Therefore, Claude painted this painting in Rome as he looked at the Roman Campagna. So you're not in France when you're seeing this painting, you're in the Roman countryside. He drew inspiration from his close, constant study of nature and changing effects of light, sketching out of doors in the countryside. He tried by every means to penetrate nature. He used to lie in the fields before the break of day and until night in order to learn to represent very, very exactly the red morning sky at sunrise and sunset in the evening hours. His observation and his transcription of light falling on landscape were unique in his time. He kept a record of his own works in a volume called the Liber Veritatis, now in the British Museum of London. Claude had a special feeling for the countryside, but his mode of life was that of a bourgeois. He was disciplined. He was quiet, good-hearted. He was industrious. He was very amiable, very shrewd, surrounded by his modest household, and he was keenly sought after in the 17th century as an artist. He had many commissions. He pursued a successful career into old age as he amassed a comfortable fortune. Claude had only 2 students in his whole life, but his paintings influenced a number of Dutch painters living in Rome at the time. Claude Lorrain's influence can also be seen in the works of certain English landscape painters of the later 19th century. Claude's normal method of nature study was by means of drawings. In his paintings, one usually sees a dark mass of foliage on one side in the foreground, contrasted with a misty, sunlit distance on the other side, which is what you see in this painting. Herdsmen tending cattle or goats move out from beneath the trees or sit beside a stream. These are also seen in this painting. His use of light from the sky above the horizon and from a hidden sun represents the light of dawn or evening, also seen in our painting. Claude Lorrain did not marry, and he lived for his work. He was on good terms with a very famous French master of the ideal landscape, Nicolas Poussin. But there was very little contact between Claude Lorrain and Poussin. Claude was basically a loner. He concentrated on mastering his art of the ideal landscape in Rome. Now let's look at another really extraordinarily beautiful painting a century later. And we're going to look today at the Rococo style of Francois Boucher and the great master of neoclassicism, Jacques-Louis David. Francois Boucher painted in the 18th century. He lived from 1703 to 1770. And this painting was done smack in the 18th century before the French Revolution. And it is very much a painting of lovers in a park in the middle of the 18th century, 1758, and under the reign of Louis XV, referred to as Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the 15th, the beloved, before Louis the 16th. Louis the 16th was the king who was executed during the French Revolution in 1789. Lovers in a Park is the largest painting in the Timken Museum and one of Boucher's finest pastoral landscapes. Here, just saw the ideal classical landscape, very small figures of Claude Lorrain. This is the opposite. Here it's very crowded. The figures are very lifelike, very prominent in the foreground. And this painting actually won the Prix de Rome, and it was the favorite of Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. It's a masterpiece of Rococo style, which the neoclassicists like Jacques-Louis David eventually rejected. They said the Rococo was too whimsical, too frivolous, not serious enough for a great painting. This painting displays Boucher's striking brushwork, an amazing sense of color, contrast to the generally dark painting of Claude Lorrain's landscape in the high Baroque classical style, more somber, more serious. Like Claude Lorrain's painting, though, this is a pastoral landscape, but Boucher's landscape is rather lush, full of much larger, graceful figures like the 2 seated lovers and the maiden passing by. Note the King Charles Spaniel, a favorite of the aristocracy and a symbol of fidelity, and the 2 Amorini sculptures above the head of the 2 lovers. This is a symbol of earthly love. The garden is a symbol of romantic love, which is represented also by the blue wreath that the female lover, seated below the male, is wearing on her arm. Note also there is a green dried up wreath hanging from one of the branches of the trees. There you go. You can see it. And why? Perhaps a symbol of their dying love. The flowers in the lover's hair are forget-me-nots, symbolic of the male lover forgetting about his lover as he looks longingly at the young maiden passing by. One can hardly see the people in Claude Lorrain's landscape that we just looked at earlier. But Boucher's landscape focuses on the people. It tells a story through pictures, placing lovers in a lush, busy, very busy garden with a stream and plenty of rich green trees and bushes and little rocks is a Rococo version of the painterly tradition of depicting lovers in the garden, a tradition that goes back to the medieval period, 11th, 12th, 13th century. The two women here are dressed in delicate pastels of blue and pink and yellow. And the man is wearing a red cape with a white lining revealed at the lower end of his rolled up sleeves, all symbols of eroticism. Letting go, rolling up your sleeves, being in the country, free from the court of Versailles. The creamy folds in the seated woman's clothing, the richly drawn details of the foliage on the trees and the bushes reveal Boucher's unparalleled virtuosity as a Rococo painter. The women's dresses are satin, voluminous, full of carefully drawn folds. Fabrics in this painting are ample, lush, very characteristic of the Rococo style. These women appear almost doll-like. Nature is radiant and inhabited here by supposedly cheerful country folk and pleasant peasant lovers. They're hardly peasants, we can see by their clothing. The subject matter is rather lighthearted and whimsical because this is essentially a huge decorative painting fit for a large room. The subject of the painting is also lighthearted, a couple in love that was out for a stroll with their spaniel in the countryside. They have stopped to rest beneath a sculpture of two Amorini. The man holds some blue flowers that he's taken from his lover's blonde hair. His beloved is perhaps daydreaming, or she's distracted by her own thoughts. His attention is also distracted by the sudden appearance of a young, supposedly peasant woman dressed in pastel colors and carrying two baskets of cut flowers that are pink and blue and white and held on her shoulders by a pole. Although this second woman is dressed in less elaborate but nevertheless beautiful clothing, she appears to be a milkmaid or a shepherdess who has been gathering her own flowers. She's walking alone, barefoot, another erotic image. The two seated lovers are also barefoot, and the man has rolled up his pants above his knees and his sleeves to suggest two lovers relaxing in the park, away from the decorum and the restraints of Versailles. The glances of the lover and the corresponding tilt of the head and the glance of the milkmaid are quite revealing. This guy has a roving eye. The exuberance and the lush depiction of nature lend a glimpse of eroticism to this masterful painting. Now let's look at Jacques-Louis David. When I say Francois Boucher and I say Jacques-Louis David, these are revered masters in the minds of the average everyday French person. Jacques-Louis David is probably the greatest of all. He was considered to be the preeminent neoclassical, bring classicism back from Rome and Greece of the early times, the 5th century AD, to France of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. His portrait of Cooper Penrose was painted in Paris in 1802, beginning of the 19th century, late 18th century. Cooper Penrose was a prominent Quaker family member from England who migrated to Waterford Island. Waterford, Crystal, folks, this guy was very wealthy. He migrated in the 17th century. Penrose became a timber merchant and inherited his father-in-law's thriving business. He was a Protestant Irish businessman who became very wealthy, but he was also an avid art collector, a generous philanthropist, and a Quaker. But Penrose's lavish taste and worldly interest didn't quite fit with the severe moral code of the Quakers. Penrose was an art patron who led a very luxurious life. He was, in fact, disowned by the Quakers because of his extravagance. And when Penrose traveled to Paris to buy art, he was introduced to the famous revolutionary Jacobin painter Jacques-Louis David. Penrose's niece, Julia, was then a student of Jacques-Louis David. How lucky for him, because this made it easier for Penrose to visit David's studio at the Louvre. But Julia had to convince Jacques-Louis David to agree to paint Penrose's portrait. And the finished painting, which is a 3/4 length portrait, shows Penrose at 63 years of age, dressed in dressed in black and some white, seated modestly against a plain brown wall. He's dressed in a somber black cutaway jacket, a white waistcoat, dark gray knee breeches, and white stockings. He is seated comfortably in a neoclassical armchair. There is no evidence of the sitter's high social status or great wealth or frivolous lifestyle. One does notice the self-conscious austerity of the painting, which must have pleased the leading Quaker community. Penrose appears to be a small man, modest, friendly, and kind. Look at the veins in Penrose's hands and the details of his fingers and the nails, which reveal David's intense classical training and his masterful skill at a realistic depiction. Again, we're in the 18th century. Remember the stilted, unnaturalistic style of the early 15th century Georgian masterpiece of the Russian icons. One notices Penrose's aging skin, his liquid eyes, and the painting is signed, and this is very important, by Louis David, and he added words which said, Louis David made this in Paris in the 10th year of the Gallic Republic, which is a reminder of David's revolutionary spirit. He was all for the revolution, which took place in 1789. David's neoclassical style, especially in the historical paintings, harkened back to emotional and historic events of ancient Greece and Rome. But and we don't see them here in the Timken, they're at the Louvre. But his portraits are more realistic. David was more than a painter, he was also a political activist. He became an active supporter of the French Revolution, a friend of the infamous Robespierre, who lived from 1758 to 1794, and who was the one who led the Reign of Terror. He was a member of the Jacobin Club. David voted in the National Convention for the execution of Louis XVI, and who was the king in France, the last king in France. And his wife, David's wife, was a royalist, divorced him because he voted for the execution of the king. After the revolution, Robespierre became the leader of France. And under Robespierre's leadership, David was effectively a dictator of the arts under this new French Republic. But Robespierre fell from power, and then David was immediately imprisoned, and Robespierre was guillotined. David's wife got him released from prison. As soon as Jacques-Louis David was released from prison, he managed once again to align himself with the leader of yet another political regime, Napoleon Bonaparte. During this period, David developed his Empire style, using warm Venetian colors. Napoleon loved David's paintings, and David became the official first court painter of the Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. David had a large number of pupils, including the notable Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres and Antoine Jean Gros, great names in French painting. Napoleon awarded him France's highest Medal of Honor. David became the Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur in 1803, 1 year after he painted the portrait of Cooper Penrose. I can show you all what the French Medal of Honor is, because I was very fortunate in my life also to receive this medal, France's highest medal awarded me, probably the only American woman who got it. After Napoleon fell from imperial power and the Bourbons returned to the throne, David was on the banned list of former revolutionaries and Bonapartists who voted for the execution of Louis XVI and who participated in the death of Louis XVII. Nevertheless, he was so powerful, this Jacques-Louis David, that the newly restored Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, granted him amnesty and offered him the position of court painter. But David refused, preferring self-exile in Brussels, where he remained until his death. Jacques-Louis David completed a number of privately commissioned portraits characterized by truth and realism. He focused on defining the subject's features without idealizing them, as he did in his historical paintings, which we see in the Louvre, which harken back to the Greek and Roman ideals of beauty. But in his portraits, David focused on defining smaller features like hands and fabrics. The compositions remain simple, with a blank background that allows the viewer to focus on the details of the subject. We can see this represented clearly in the portrait of Cooper Penrose, whose hands are a prominent feature, one hand facing downward and the other facing sideways. Penrose's face is neither stern nor happy, but complacent. And you can see how Jacques-Louis David painted all the very intricate details of this face, with the eyelids heavy, the wrinkles on the side of his cheek, his hair balding at the top with a few snips of hair here and there on his bald head. His clothing is painted with great detail also, drawing attention to the creases in Penrose's dark gray knee pants and the tie of his white neck scarf. Jacques-Louis David, amazingly enough, the neoclassicist, learned to draw from the Rococo Francois Boucher, who was also his distant relative, by the way. And he was a very famous Rococo painter. But David eventually turned away from the Rococo style of his earlier paintings, and he became the greatest neoclassical master. David considered the Rococo style frivolous, favored a more severe, more austere style of the Greek and Roman classics that could inspire the onlookers to heroism and patriotism. He believed the subject of an artwork should have a moral. When David was finally awarded the Prix de Rome, he left for Italy in 1775, where he studied the works of Raphael and the 17th century masters such as Poussin, Caravaggio, and Carracci. There in Rome, he deepened his belief in the classical culture. He returned to Paris in 1780 and was made an official member of the Royal Academy. He's regarded as a symbol of French national pride and identity. He was a vital force in the development of European and French art in the modern era. The birth of Romanticism is traditionally credited to the paintings of 18th century French artists such as Jacques-Louis David. Now we move on to the Dutch gallery. Yep, we have a Breugel, Peter Breugel the Elder, painted in the Renaissance period of 1557. The 16th century is the height of the Renaissance. And here we see the parable of the sower. And the artist is Peter Breugel the Elder, who was born in 1525 and died in 1569. This is one of Breugel's earliest signed religious paintings, done before he left for Brussels. The rather dark foreground of this cosmic landscape style is painted with warm earth tones. We see a small peasant figure scattering seeds in the foreground on the pasture, which is made of hard, rocky soil, where we see a dead tree. According to the parable, and in Matthew 13:3-13, chickens in this somber region devour the seeds. Thorns abound. There are lots of large stones in this not very good ground. But below, to the right, in the middle distance, near a chapel, on a beautiful lush ground, we can see the good ground, all in lighter colors of green and bright blue, where the seed has multiplied 36 and 100-fold. The church that you see reflects Jesus' teaching and the productive life. There is a narrow, beautiful blue river that flows diagonally from the right middle distance into a broad estuary. On the river, we see 3 small boats moored on the right bank of the river. A small crowd, perhaps you can point to that crowd on the right bank, is gathering near the first boat to hear Jesus preaching. You can hardly see it. It's very, very tiny. Further along on the right bank is a small town with a fort on a hill below the high, steep, rocky bluffs. Below this to the left is a larger town. In the background to the right, we see a huge alpine bunch of crags, mountains that draw our attention upward to the cloudy sky on the upper right and back to the high, dark green foliage of the trees on the left. This artistic work has a theological and moral lesson. We see on the lower left foreground birds that are eating the seed. Plants sprout, but then they die, and the seeds fall on bad ground where nature dies. Some seeds fall on good ground. So this is a very interesting painting. Now we come to a 17th century masterpiece by Rembrandt, a Dutch painter of great renown. Rembrandt was born in 1606 and died in 1669, again, in the midst of this great 17th century era of the great arts. You see in front of you Saint Bartholomew, a portrait, 1657. Before I go any further, I have to tell you a small secret. Every time I look at this painting, I keep thinking I see Robert De Niro. Don't you see the resemblance? I'm sure that Rembrandt had no clue who Robert De Niro will be in the 20th century, but he looks a lot like him. Rembrandt was born and studied painting in Leiden. He often treated biblical, historical, and mythological themes in his paintings. Rembrandt moved to Amsterdam in 1631 to 1632, where he painted many small bust-length and large full-length portraits. He married Saskia van Uylenburg, who was the daughter of an important politician and the cousin of an art dealer. So Rembrandt, a poor painter, married well. He had 3 sons who died before their own father. With his wife's rich dowry and Rembrandt's artistic success, he lived well in Amsterdam from 1635 to 1640. But he became bankrupt in 1656 after his wife's death in 1642. Nevertheless, he produced hundreds of drawings, etchings, and paintings, and he was an effective teacher. He had a very sad life, and the sadness, Rembrandt's sadness, is reflected in Rembrandt's use of dark colors and very minimal light. So St. Bartholomew is a rather large, very dramatic portrait of a martyr who endured many trials and tribulations, as Rembrandt himself did. He suffered at the death of his wife and suffered at the death of his own 3 sons. St. Bartholomew here carries a butcher's knife in his right hand, and the knife is an attribute. He was one of 12 apostles. What does this knife represent? St. Bartholomew was literally skinned alive in Armenia. Rembrandt painted independent pictures of apostles throughout his career, and he approached biblical figures as individuals rather than as types. This apostle appears to be determined, resolute, but clearly preoccupied, perhaps by spiritual concerns. His eyes are animated, his brow is furrowed, his mouth is slightly open, as if he's contemplating a deep question of ethical concern. His pose indicates that he is somewhat unsettled by these concerns. And in the midst of this overwhelming darkness of this painting, we are drawn to the whiteness of the apostle's hand, his face, and the knife, in contrast to the deep black background, dark hair, deep brown robes, and dark brown mustache and beard. The light in this painting comes from the forehead on his face and comes from the hand carrying the knife. Rembrandt used loose brushwork, and the handle of his brush, he used the actual handle of his brush to paint marks on the thumb of St. Bartholomew's hand with the knife. His hand displays pentimenti at the white cuff and wrist. Rembrandt seems to penetrate the inner life of this apostle. Rembrandt signed the painting in the mid-left section, the mid-left side section. This is a portrait of a holy figure who is portrayed as a real person who has suffered. Rembrandt did not idealize him as a saint, but instead made this apostle seem lifelike and complex. Well, I ended with this talk with Rembrandt, one of the highlights of the museum, but we haven't reached the end yet because we still want to look at the American Gallery, where we see 2 painters. Eastman Johnson, who painted the Cranberry Harvest Island of Nantucket in 1880, and we'll see finally John Singleton Copley, who painted a portrait of Mrs.Thomas Gage in 1771, only a few years before the American Revolution, 1771. So let's look first at the Cranberry Harvest of Eastman Johnson. Johnson has been praised as the most American of American painters, and yet he moved in 1849 to Dusseldorf and enrolled in the Royal Academy, worked a little later in the studio of the American artist Emanuel Lotze. He went to Holland in 1851, and he achieved great skills. He was offered the position of court painter in The Hague, but he declined this honor. He moved to Paris in 1855 to study with Thomas Couture. He returned to the United States. So he's in Dusseldorf, Germany, he's in The Hague, and he's in Paris. He's trained in Europe. He returned to the United States later that year on the date of his mother's death. Although he was foreign trained, he wanted finally to find an American subject matter to paint that would allow him to reveal his European technical achievements. So he went to Wisconsin, made sketches, but they were never fulfilled. He painted his family's Georgetown neighborhood. This was a success, and he was elected associate of the National Academy of Design. Johnson's reputation grew when he became the foremost American figure painter. He did portraits of the leaders of the East Coast Society. In the 1870s, Johnson began to paint genre scenes from the island of Nantucket, Massachusetts, where he and his family spent their summers. And the Cranberry Harvest, the island of Nantucket, is the culmination of Johnson's Nantucket work, celebrating the New England outdoor life, which we are fortunate enough to have in the Timken Museum. Let's look at the Cranberry Harvest, island of Nantucket painting. We see a bog on the north side of Nantucket Island, along the region known as the Cliff. The bog is painted as brown with dark grasses, some wildflowers, and a few red berries. People in this painting are mostly women, children, and old men picking berries. The picked berries are then loaded onto a wagon, which you see off to the right. In the distance, figures singly and in pairs climb the cliff up the hill toward North Road. This is a very detailed landscape. In the distance, we see the Nantucket spires, a lighthouse, and a ship and shipping. The figures in the foreground are very real, and our attention is drawn to the kneeling cranberry pickers, and of course to the only figure standing, which is a woman with a hat drawn to the kneeling cranberry pickers, and of course looking at the approaching boy carrying an infant. Maybe it's her own child. Johnson even painted a windmill on the horizon left of center to give us a better idea of the Nantucket landscape. This is a late afternoon scene, which we can tell because there's a pink glow at the horizon. The pickers are wearing bright colored clothing. They all exchange glances and gestures. The emotion of the people in the painting is very restrained. Copley has an evocative rather than a descriptive technique. This technique gives an air of spontaneous truth to the painting. It is as if he is painting what he sees. He is not trying to make a political statement about the plight of the cranberry pickers. Johnson painted 17 paintings of the Cranberry Harvest at the last quarter of the 19th century. Now, let's look at another painter, an American painter, a century earlier. By the way, this is one of my favorite paintings. John Singleton Copley lived from 1738 to 1815, and he drew the portrait of Mrs.Thomas Gage at a very important moment in time, in 1771, 5 years before the American Revolution. John Singleton Copley has been called the greatest American artist of the 18th century. He grew up in Boston, where there was the beginning of all the political uprisings, by the way, in the United States. His stepfather introduced him to artistic theory, to engraving, composition, technique, and entrepreneurship. He later became the painter of choice for prestigious Bostonians seeking portraits. He earned praise, for example, from painters such as Benjamin West and Sir Joshua Reynolds, who wanted him to study abroad. But John Singleton Copley refused to study abroad until later in 1774, where he spent 1 year in Italy and on the continent before settling finally in London. He had success with history paintings and portraits during the 1790s, and he continued to paint until his death in 1815. Now let's look at this particular portrait, a stunning portrait. In 1771, Copley traveled to New York, where, because of his reputation, he had 17 commissions for portraits. The very first work he hastened to do was a 3/4 length portrait of a Mrs.Thomas Gage, who you see in this portrait. Copley said of his own work, "It is, quote, beyond compare the best lady's portrait I ever drew," unquote. Now, who is this Mrs. Gage? She was referred to as a duchess by her husband and by her fellow officers. Her husband was the commander-in-chief of the British forces in North America around 1771. Clearly a person the Americans did not like very much, because it was just 5 years before the American Revolution. And Mrs. Gage, nevertheless, was known throughout New York and New Jersey for her charm. Copley never before painted a woman in such exotic clothing or in such a state of melancholic reverie. Mrs. Gage has beautiful white skin, revealed by her décolleté dress of iridescent rose silk, which loosely covers over a white lace-trimmed undergarment or chemise. She wears a jeweled brooch at the top of her dress and an embroidered belt at her waist. This dress was quite fashionable in the exotic style of Turquerie, or in the Turkish mode. Excuse me. Mrs. Gage never visited Turkey herself, but her father was born there. She wears a delicate necklace of 2 strings of white pearls, purity, and her headdress is amplified by a turban-like swath of dark, bejeweled drapery. At her sleeves, we see more of the white chemise, adorned with, again, white pearls on her arm. Her hairstyle is quite simple, below the exotic turban she wears on her head. She's very beautiful. The costume she's wearing is voluminous, with many folds and drapes, giving it an air of sensuality, although it is clear that she's a woman of elite social status. She was an officer's wife and a prominent woman in this region. Here she's more like a sultana in her very casual pose, her faraway, staring gaze, and her glimpse of a smile. With her hand leaning on the elegant blue satin chair with buttons, she seems arrogantly indifferent, engaged perhaps in pensive thought about serious matters. Copley exhibited this portrait in London in 1772. But many friends didn't like it, although they saw it as a work of art. They expected that a portrait of a distinguished wife of a British commander would be less artistic, less beautiful, less informal, and more rigorous likeness of the woman herself. But lovers of the arts gave this work great praise. The portrait remained in England until the mid-1980s. The Gages left America in 1775 for good reason and returned to their primary residence in London, where they raised and educated their 11 children. Amazing that this woman can look like this and raised 11 children. Mrs. Gage lived in London to the age of 90 and never remarried after her husband's death. And that is the end of my decoding of the great masterpieces. There are other masterpieces in the Timken. I picked these because these are the ones that I like, and I thought they could tell a little story of the development of art and its history. If you have any questions, please give them to me now. If I can answer them, I will.
Thank you so much, Susan, for such a great presentation. You picked such great pieces, and this is such a great presentation. We did go a little bit over, so if there is one question, we can take it quickly, but otherwise I see lots of thanks in the chat. We had some thanks from Facebook on what a great presentation this was, and from me as well. So thank you so much, Susan. While you may be typing a question, I'll just again remind everyone that these tours and any previous tours have been recorded and will be posted on our social media channels, our Facebook and our YouTube page, if you would like to go ahead and look those up, as well as any future tours. If you need information for those, please feel free to check out our website, the Timken Museum website, in order to get information for any future tours. I see Annette saying thank you again in the chat, so thank you so much, Susan. If there are no other questions, I'll go ahead and close things out. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you again to Susan for such a wonderful tour.
Thank you again. Thank you very much. My pleasure.